Hello and welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today returns to this programme after the release of her debut novel, Assembly, in 2021. The book details the class disparities and identity in Britain today, and it was met with praise and shortlisted for many awards, including the Goldsmiths Prize and the Orwell Prize for political fiction. Since then, she's spent her time writing her second novel. Universality opens with a piece of long-form journalism, A Fool's Gold, by fiction magazine Alazon, focusing on an attack with a gold bar that was stolen at an illegal rave held at a sprawling estate during the 2020 UK lockdown. The rest of the story follows the impact the news article had on its participants, the writer, and the person at the centre of the crime. It's a tale of how language and its perception is used in society from the basis of journalism and how it's used to make a distinctive narrative. Natasha Brown, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Now, in Assembly, you never told us very much about the central character. We didn't even know her name. And it was refreshing and interesting and, at the end, disturbing that she was saying goodbye, really, and we just never even knew who she was, although we knew so much about her. You seem to me quite similar. We don't know very much about you at all. So, where were you born?
London. I'm an obnoxious Londoner.
And tell us about your upbringing. Was it filled with books?
Yes, my parents and my grandparents always encouraged me to read anything I wanted. So I read a lot of age-inappropriate books, like A Clockwork Orange, as a child. But I think that was really great because they really gave me this love for reading. And I think though I didn't go on to study literature at university, it was always something fun. And I feel really grateful that it just got to be a passion and a pastime for me.
Were you quite a swotty kid?
I was a horrible dork. Absolutely. I was a bit of a maths geek, a bit of a computer geek, much more likely to be at my computer or at my desk than outside. That was me.
So you then went on and did, pure maths at Cambridge?
Yeah, I did more pure modules than anything else, yes.
Tell us about that time.
Yeah, it was really fun, I think, to just have the permission to study something I was interested in for 3 years. And it felt like an enormous change of pace. As I said, I'm from London, so moving to a much smaller city where you kind of know everyone and you get to know the place felt incredible. The winds were freezing. My coat wasn't up to the task, but I really had a brilliant time. And I think I spent a lot of time thinking about how to learn, how to approach problems, how to, I guess, develop the skills you get from school into something really new. And I'm so grateful for that.
When were you there?
2008. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, because a lot of your work tackles racism, and I just wonder, in 2008 in Britain, in that very academic environment, as a young black woman, particularly that your gender actually doing maths, if that was ever an issue.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree, I think always when you're in the minority somewhere, it's not necessarily easy. And I think I've heard from other people who've sort of been the first to sort of push into a particular area. Sometimes you have to shoulder a bit of the difficulty that hopefully makes it easier for the people who come along afterwards. But I think really the big thing that made a huge impression on me at the time was the credit crunch. 2008, being at university then, I remember hearing tales about maths grads, economics grads who didn't have jobs when they left, and that was sort of unheard of. And I think that was the big shock and kind of culture shift that made such a difference while I was at university. And I think the shadow of the credit crunch and I guess the evolving position of the financial services industry is also something that looms large in both of my books, I think, because it made such an impression on me back then.
And of course you were one of the lucky ones, though, or talented ones. You went straight from university into a job in finance.
Yes, it was a few years later, so things had recovered a bit.
Yeah.
But I sort of did what I think a lot of dorky young people do, where you just kind of speed run school, university, career. I always knew that's what I wanted to do and just focused on.
But you had a plan that by your 30s, you'd do something else.
I knew I wanted to take a break, a career break. And I think like one of the great things about studying STEM and STEM careers is you kind of get the opportunity to do that. You know, if you get to a point in your career where you've reached a certain level where you can go away and come back, it gives you immense freedom. I mean, it's just been really incredible. This isn't how I imagined I'd spend my career break. I thought I might be going to a yoga retreat or something like that, or running a marathon. But it's been really incredible to do this. And it just feels so special. It feels like I get to be a writer. I get to meet so many people I've admired and read for so long. I get to write these books and have conversations with people about them. But I never have the pressure of this is my job and worrying about whether or not I write the next book and when I get it out, because I know that my normal life and my normal work is waiting for me. But in the meantime, I just get to have this crazy experience.
So there was no sort of pressure of the second novel of this book because you didn't need to do it, right?
Absolutely. Like I wasn't even sure if I would write a second novel, and I really had to take some time and think about, did I have something more? As you said in that brilliant introduction, you know, this book is really interested in language, and I had a lot of time to think about, did I want to approach the question of language and neutrality in language from a different perspective? Did I think I had something interesting and new to say? And when that kind of started to take shape for me and I felt excited about the project, I could do it, which felt great. But, you know, sometimes people ask me now, well, what about book 3? And I don't know, and I don't have any plans for that just yet. And that feels really nice too, to have that luxury.
The book is about language, but it started really in common with your first book too, in a very mathsy way. It was a spreadsheet.
Yes, absolutely. The spreadsheet, I used it slightly differently this time around because this book really dabbles in the mystery and thriller genre, which I'm a huge fan of, a very squeamish reader, but a huge fan of those sorts of books. And one thing I've noticed is that mystery readers and thriller readers are the most attentive readers out there. They pay attention to every detail. They're sceptical of everything.
You're always looking for a clue.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to make sure that even to the tiniest detail, if it seems innocuous on the first read, when you come back around, it's a smoking gun. So I really used the spreadsheet to keep track of essentially this big list of everything that happens and when, and then sort of another column for what the different characters know at different points of time, a column for each character, and then finally what they say they know to the different characters at different points of time. And then finally I had a different sheet in the spreadsheet that was actually what gets presented to the reader of all of that other information at different times. But it made it so much more comfortable for me, I think, to take on a challenge like this, knowing that I could check back and make sure that everything tallied out.
Yeah, and I mean, there are so many layers in there. As a reader, you're seeing all the layers, even if you don't know exactly what they are, which is extraordinary. And this, of course, has multiple narrators. Your first book it was internal completely, and this is all of these different people saying what they think from their perspective, but we don't even know if they believe it.
Yeah, absolutely. I really wanted that sort of big feel of an ensemble novel, and all of these different voices and very different perspectives, and just sort of pressing them against one another and allowing the reader to kind of decide who do they believe, what do they believe, what feels compelling and what feels closest to them. So it was a huge challenge, I think, particularly making the voices feel really distinct and feel right for the characters. And, you know, there's characters right from their 20s up to their 50s. So it's sort of a broad range of different voices and generations to bring to life. But I loved the challenge.
And a huge range of political opinion. I mean, extraordinary. I mean, we're going to go into that. But first, Kristen Rupenian and Cat Person. That, of course, was this New Yorker short story, long read, call it what you like, but went absolutely viral. Yeah. I don't know anybody who hasn't read it. And if you haven't, listeners, you've got to read it. Because that, along with the earlier work of Tom Wolfe, and we'll get onto that, is really what sparked this idea. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, I was fascinated with Cat Person, which, as you said, it was a short story, it was fiction, and it went viral. But the interesting thing was, a lot of people didn't realise it was fiction when they read it, because, you know, they got it via an email or a WhatsApp group or however they were exposed to it. They thought it was a personal essay or something factual. And I thought it was so fascinating that fiction and non-fiction had become so close that it takes a lot of, I guess, sort of media literacy to really understand what you're reading when you're not presented with the context. And as you said, Tom Wolfe was also influencing my thinking here, because back in the 60s he came up with this school of writing that he called the New Journalism, where they very deliberately took techniques from novels and put it into their non-fiction writing. So, you know, bringing readers inside the internal monologue of the people they were profiling, sort of shaping their articles around different scenes scenes and having a narrative arc that comes through. And it was a hugely successful style of writing, and it's everywhere today. It's become the norm. And I was really fascinated in the way that online journalism and the move towards more and more online journalism in recent years has sort of heated up that style of writing, so that now we might read fiction, we might read non-fiction, but it's all together, and journalism can often read really like a pulpy novel. And I thought, can you take that style of writing and put it back in the novel? What happens then if you clash the sort of more traditional fictional style up against with the journalistic style we're used to reading today? Can you reveal something about both ways of approaching truth, I suppose?
And you've done this brilliantly. I mean, it's extraordinary. And of course, what you had to do at the beginning then was actually write that long read so that we could read it and then take what we needed to know into the rest of the book. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, that was a huge challenge, and I put myself on a reading diet for 9 months where I only read non-fiction because I really wanted to get to understand it as a genre. Because I think journalism is a genre like any other, but we don't really apply the same critical eye to it that we do to maybe other genres and things that we think of as purely fiction. And I was thinking a lot about, there's a fantastic journalist, Janet Malcolm, who came up with in her book, The Journalist and the Murderer, this thing she terms the journalistic eye. So it's the first person narrator in journalism, and it carries enormous weight. You know, it carries the weight of the publication. It is the truth, it is impartial. And when we read it, we find it hugely credible. And I thought, perhaps that's what makes us sort of not notice it as a form of writing, because we're so busy believing it. But then I think one of the most fascinating things about the novel is we don't trust the first person. The sort of unreliable narrator is the norm in the novel. So what happens when you take this journalistic first person and make it an unreliable narrator? Does it reveal something, once again, I suppose, about how this style of writing works? But I knew that for this book to work and for it to have the appeal of sort of unfolding the different layers and seeing the different perspectives, I had to get that article right, and it had to not feel out of place within a novel, but it also had to set up, I suppose, the reader's expectations of what this core mystery was, what happened, and who the key players are.
Somebody is, and this is no plot spoiler, somebody is bludgeoned by a gold bar. Did you have to touch a gold bar? Did you hold a gold bar to write that?
Apparently you can go to the Bank of England and sort of lift one up in a transparent box, but it was during lockdown when I was writing those scenes, so I did a lot of research instead, and sort of lifted one of my 12 kilogram weights to get a sense of how heavy it would be, and also kind of looking at, you know, criticisms of when you see on a TV show them putting like 100 gold bars in a duffel bag and throwing it over their shoulder, which would just be impossible. So it spent a lot of time really trying to get what the actual feel of it would be like. But yeah, I've not touched one yet, I'm afraid.
So, I mean, because the characters disagree with them about how soft it is and whether it would get scuffed by beating someone over the head with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the strangest things about gold is it is so delicate in a way. And like most of, I suppose, our precious materials, I guess if I think of something like diamonds or what have you, feels quite tough, what I imagine. But gold is actually very, very delicate. And even the details of how does a person get a gold bar was very complicated. You can't just go to the shop and buy one. It's quite a complex process to actually get one in your possession.
Yeah.
So,
let alone to get it delivered, as this one was.
But it was, you know, when I was thinking about why this gold bar and this really outlandish thing, I think, you know, these viral articles always have that outlandish element, but it came from somewhere really human. There's this banker character who, he's a bit of an awful guy, he's his own worst enemy, but he was working at the time of the credit crunch. And, you know, he comes from a working class background, went into this career, earned loads of money, had a lifestyle he'd never imagined before, and then suddenly lost it all with the credit crunch. And what I found was common among a lot of people who had that experience was afterwards they bought gold. They bought this thing that they felt wouldn't lose value and they could hold on to and they could protect their family with. So it was a really human impulse to buy gold and buy this feeling of protection. But what happens if you just take it to a ridiculous extreme, I suppose?
And of course, we're kind of back there now, aren't we? I mean, in terms of people trying to find something that's not going to lose their assets when you don't know what's coming down the pipe economically.
Absolutely. I think it's just such a human feeling, like this feeling of uncertainty and this feeling of how do I keep my family safe? What's the right thing to do? Like, there are no easy answers.
Gold as well as in gold standard, the gold standard of journalism. And this idea of how do we come to a shared idea of truth? What is truth?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, yeah. And I think what is the rhetoric of truth I'm really interested in? How do we write in a way that feels objective and like, a voice of authority? And how do we write in a way that feels very partial and feels very untrustworthy? And I really am interested in, I guess, isolating the specific words, the specific way of using language that gives off that impression.
So there's as you've pointed out, a big difference. So in the 90s, for instance, you had all these people, and I'm trying to think of names, someone like, say, Julie Burchill, or now perhaps Lionel Shriver, people writing very controversial stuff. But back then, of course, without the internet. And the way I guess that's changed, and that's what you're pointing out really in the book too, is just how you now need to chase those clicks.
Absolutely. I think it's really fascinating. As you said, in the 90s, these women came out of nowhere and they just had a really strong firebrand voice, a way of writing that really resonated. And they were paid huge sums of money and they were widely read. And, sometimes a single word, like they were being paid about £5 a word, which is an incredible amount of money. And you don't get that sort of money for writing journalism today. And I was really fascinated in the way that those women were so successful at that time. But now that things have changed and things are more online, and I suppose journalism is competing on the global stage, some of them haven't quite been able to capture, I suppose, the public imagination in quite the same way. So the sort of columnist character in Universality, I imagined her as someone who's about half generation younger than those women. So she watched them come up, felt quite jealous seeing their success, and then waited and bided her time for her opportunity. And now she feels she knows how to differentiate herself. She knows how to win in this current moment. And I really wanted to know, could I bring someone like her to life on the page and not make her sort of a two-dimensional character, but a fully compelling character, someone who just is raw charisma and knows how to talk to people? Could I bring that to life?
Her name is Lenny, and she appeals to many people reading from different perspectives, and I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, I love that about Lenny, because one of my favourite things was sending this manuscript to my friends and getting messages saying, I hate Lenny, but I want to read more of her. Because, she is brash and she's mean and rude, but she's also so smart and really very funny. And she says things that we sometimes might find quite appalling, but says them in a way that makes us laugh. And I think that's such an important part of the skill of being an effective communicator. She's got a real elasticity in how she presents, I suppose, her message, and also a lot of willingness to not just stick to a single side. She embraces a lot of different positions and really just understands how to communicate, how to capture the public mood, I suppose.
And I love the sort of descriptions of her, just picking something that happens to be there, the issue of the day or a poem or whatever, but then just throwing in a bit of data, just to and the way she is very kind of open about, honestly, how she's manipulating people.
I think she's an absolute pragmatist. And I don't even know if she sees it as manipulation so much as just giving people what they want. I think she truly sees her form of writing as a form of entertainment and as a form of, I suppose, pastime, something that gives people what they want to read when they read the papers, if they still read the papers. That's what she cares about.
Yeah, so I mean, her sort of breakthrough, she writes what they call the secular Bible. Tell us about that, because it's railing against capitalism, really.
Absolutely, yeah. So she had her first book that she published, I think it was 2016 or 2017, called No Mo Woke. And it was a very populist, sort of punchy book. But she found that it didn't quite hit the way that she was hoping it would. It made a big media splash, but it didn't really bring her the opportunities she was looking for. So she adapted her message. She sort of went for a much more wordy title and tried to appeal to, I suppose, a more middle-class readership, or that squeezed middle that we hear so much about, people who are very educated, but, as we were talking about before, in a financially precarious situation. So she adjusted the message and she embraced ideas of anti-capitalism, but still kept in some of the sort of spicier opinions from her original work, and found that captured people's opinions in a much more successful way, and that brought her onto television, onto the radio, onto all of the literary festivals, and gave her the boost that she really wanted to kind of be able to take her career to the next stage.
Because I love in the way when you describe the original book how she discovers that the people that agree with her or want to read her book aren't the type that have bookshelves.
Well, I think there's this thing of books we hear a lot about, but who do we actually know who bought them and read them? Yeah.
This brings us on to the fact that politics is really economics. That's one of the things you're saying here.
Absolutely. I think a lot of the discussions that get cast as politics and about political ideas really come down to this shift in the economy in the UK. We've shifted towards a much more STEM-focused economy. Jobs in tech, jobs in research, all of these sorts of things are one of the huge drivers in our economy. And that means different jobs for different people. The type of work I've done in my career didn't exist 20 years ago. Like, the life I've had just wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. And I think that shift and that real pull for people, you know, the maths dorks at school to study these subjects and go on to these careers has changed sort of what society looks like a little bit. And also, I think, kind of what wealth and generational wealth is like. You know, it used to be that you could sort of guarantee your children a particular life if you came from a middle class background, but that feels a little bit more precarious today. So I think when we cast that difficulty, and very real difficulty as politics, I think we miss what's actually happening, and we miss a way of really talking about what's shifting and what we can do to make things feel fairer for everybody.
So, I mean, one of the things that Lenny is railing against is the fact that her son has no opportunities, is a complete waste in a way. But that brings her on to the fact that of DEI, of diversity. And again, we see this coming back into the novel. There's an excruciating dinner party where this is also discussed. Just unpack that a little for us.
Yeah, I think Lenny's son is really her Achilles heel, because in a way he's the sort of person who she's advocating for. But he really doesn't help himself. He doesn't have any qualifications. He doesn't hold down a job. He feels left out of society. And I think she's a bit frustrated that she sees him as kind of feckless and someone who just won't do what he needs to do. But at the same time, she makes a very compelling case that the world's been unfair to him. And that, I think, is her central conflict. How does she tie those two positions together? Because I think the best thing from my perspective about STEM careers, and why that's what I'll go back to, and that's what I still spend my time going to schools and encouraging students to pursue, is that they're fair in a way that other jobs really haven't been. If you get the qualification, if you demonstrate you can do the work, it's a clear binary whether or not you can do it. There's no sort of room for discretion about whether or not you're capable of doing the job. And I think it's very easy to cast that as a scary DEI sort of decision because, of course, that leads to different demographics in the workplace. But it really just comes down to who can do the job and who gets the qualifications. And that's always going to be tough. And I think, again, it comes back to this economic shift. But how do we talk about it in the media? How do the people who kind of make money from getting people riled up characterise what's going on? And also just the fact that a lot of these jobs, you know, jobs in the quaternary sector, we don't see what those people look like. You know, I hear about how it used to be you'd go to the bank and speak to the bank manager about getting a mortgage for your house. Now you press a button and it goes off and an algorithm decides, and we know nothing about who writes those algorithms. So it creates this scary monster that we can create a narrative around.
Absolutely. These are some of the things that are discussed at this dinner, which is kind of the most awkward sort of social
dinner party.
It's hosted by Hannah, who's the journalist who writes the original article, but she's there with her university friends who really haven't had much to do with her at all until she suddenly has her little moment in the sun. And they're all very different, and they come from sort of different perspectives. There's a lot about class in there, isn't there? I wonder if you'd talk to us about those relationships.
Absolutely. You know, I think one of the most interesting things about university is it puts you in a totally different world. You meet people from all over the country, from different countries and from totally different financial backgrounds to you, and you're all on something of an equal footing. Obviously, differences in your background come into play, but you have your loan and all of this, and you can all sort of get along and have this experience together. But when you come out of that bubble and you go back to the real world and you're trying to keep up with these people, it suddenly becomes very difficult. Can you afford to go out and spend, you know, £100 on a meal? Can you afford to travel easily? All of these sorts of things. And I guess the bonds that hold friendship groups together become much more complex when you're back in real life. And Hannah really finds this at this dinner party. She's had some success with her viral article, and she's really using that as an opportunity to try and get back in with her friends from university. But there's so many subtle digs and subtle ways that she just can't quite ease into the social group, and even down to them judging her for getting her wine from M&S. Which to me, I think a bottle of Plonk from M&S is pretty nice, but all of those come into it.
The title, Universality, is reflected in lots of ways through the book. There's this band of hippie anarchists, and they have that title. There's also Universe 25 was this experiment with mice.
Yeah.
Worth just running us through that.
So this comes up at the dinner party. There was a researcher called John Calhoun, again in the 60s, who came up with these mice experiments. So he put them all in this big mice society, like eight perfect mice. He put them in there and gave them everything, all the food they wanted, all the water. They could travel anywhere they wanted to see what would happen. The only thing was they couldn't leave this society. And at first, the population grew, the mice thrived, but then it got to a point where he just noticed total collapse of the society. All of a sudden, the mice weren't performing their roles anymore. The female mice weren't having children. The male mice couldn't find a role in the society because people weren't dying. They had enough food, so there wasn't really an opportunity for them to take over the roles they would have otherwise taken. And soon the mice were all attacking one another and not eating and just died out completely. And he had a lot of strange interpretations for what that meant for society more broadly. And it was, I guess, viral of its time. It really captured imaginations. But I felt it was quite fascinating because it captured a lot of the problems, I suppose, that are being discussed more broadly in society today. And one of the things I think that was quite interesting about that mouse society was the hyperconnectivity. They could go anywhere, they could communicate with any mouse, but they couldn't leave. And I think that probably feels familiar to a lot of us today.
No, absolutely. Class is a big part of it. Martin kind of demonstrates what class is.
Yeah, Martin is this absolutely obnoxious young man of letters, I think he'd describe himself as. But he is interesting because he's so elastic in his class identity, and we don't know exactly where he's from, but he's able to present in a way that fits right in with his much wealthier friends. And when we first see him, we see him through the journalist Hannah's eyes, and she really looks up to him. And, you know, he wears worn-out clothes, and she sees this as just showing what a serious person he is. But later we see him through Lenny's eyes, and she looks at the way he dresses and the way he acts very differently. We see it sort of presented differently. But I think it really comes back to one of these things about class. You know, we think about class or often talk about class as household income, but I think it's never quite been household income. It's probably always been a bit more about household assets. But more generally, someone like Lenny, who's actually really quite wealthy, is able to present as working class because so much of how your class identity is interpreted is a performance. It's how you speak, it's how you interact with people, it's what you eat, it's where you go. So you can be elastic with your class identity. And I think that's something quite interesting too, in the way that sometimes, you know, these big lines are drawn between different classes of people, whereas actually I think it's all a bit more fluid today.
And this comes up again when you describe the hippie anarchists. You just give such brilliant descriptions of them, and you can tell, you know, sort of people called India with a Y and things, that what kind of background they've come from, and just how often being a hippie anarchist is the preserve of the rich and privileged.
Well, yeah, and they are incredibly sincere, and particularly their leader, Pegasus. He's hugely sincere about this, and he's concerned, you know. He sees himself as building these intentional communities and places where people can live with the land and don't need money. And one of his big gripes is that most of the intentional communities in the UK cost money to join, and quite a bit of money, you know, 30k, 50k. That's out of reach for most people. And I think there's this real contention between what it actually takes to say, I reject society, I reject the rat race, I want to live differently, and the sort of impulse behind it, and the very sincere impulse that I want a different kind of world. Money, in so many ways, is the thing that allows people to have these experiences.
How do you think this book talks to our current situation? I'm talking about Donald Trump, obviously, and the way the media is now classed as the enemy.
You know, I think it's so hard, particularly because you write a book years before it ever comes to shelves. So I don't try to be too much of a specific moment. I think really what it feels that it's useful that I can do as a writer is focus on that meta conversation. How do we frame the way we talk with one another? How does the media operate? Where are we falling short? I think these are the things I'm really interested in, and this is what the book tries to get down to, because I think there are ways for us to find more common ground than it sometimes seems like we have. But so much of the polarisation that, you know, gets clicks online, as we were talking about, pushes us apart rather than allowing us to really understand each other. I'm
not going to push you about a third book because you won't be pushed, but I understand 3D printing is something you're into.
Yeah, so that was a slight error. I'm into 3D modelling and 3D photography.
What's 3D modelling?
Right, so basically books, so much of how books are publicised today is beautiful photographs, beautiful videos online. But these cost a lot of money to make, and most books don't get them because they don't have the big budget. And this was something I really noticed with my first book. It was a very thin book, so your standard sort of way of making a virtual photo of the book didn't really work. And it had like some odd elements that you just couldn't get a real representation of. So I spent a lot of time, there's some software called Blender, which was the 3D software that recently was used in an Oscar-winning film, which was quite huge for it. But you can basically build virtual objects. It's basically what you'd use to kind of make a video game. So I basically make books in this 3D software and then sort of pose them, make a little set, put lights in place, put props around them and take photographs. And that's been so much fun. I've been working on that for the past few months, and I've made some sort of little photographs that are now sort of on the product listing for this book and a couple of other books online, and also made a fun little video where there's multiple books kind of coming in and out. But it's been really fun to find a way to, I suppose, create the type of media that we need for books, but is too expensive for often books that, you know, aren't the big bestseller books to kind of have access to.
Where can we see this?
So on my Instagram, there are plenty of images that look like photographs, but are actually these renders.
Extraordinary. Natasha Brown, you are an extraordinary person. I'm so pleased we've finally met. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us.
Oh, this is wonderful. Thanks for having me back.
Universality by Natasha Brown is published by Faber and Faber, and it's out now. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the production team of Steph Chungu and Flynn Simons. And you can download this show and previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.